All right, hello everyone, and welcome. The clock has just ticked 3:30, and in the interest of time, we might get us started while others gradually join in. We are recording this seminar for dissemination online later. So, in case you want to manage your microphone and video, please take that into account. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land where La Trobe University campuses are located here in Victoria. Today, I join you from the land of Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. We recognize the contribution of Indigenous Australians to the university and the Australian society, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. Now, we have an excellent line of speakers today with leading work in the area of teaching and teacher ed, especially in the conceptual and empirical work that they have done in the area of difficult knowledge and what engagement with difficult knowledge really entails for the classroom practices of teachers and educators. And I guess this is a really timely issue as well. The challenges that we face today, I think, are such that really requires us to think critically about many of the dilemmas that we face. Not that we didn't have challenges and crises in the past, but I guess the scope and the scale and intensity of some of the challenges that we are facing today are quite unprecedented. And I know we must have heard the word unprecedented in an unprecedented way in the last few years. To quote the American linguist and political activist Noam Chomsky in a very recent interview he did, we sort of reached to a point, to just the exact quote, I'm trying to bring that up. We have reached to the most dangerous point in human history. We can think about continued armed conflict and war, the specter of war, as well as the climate crisis, which really threatens our existence as a species, sustainable existence on the planet. So in this seminar, we want to open some conversation and dialogue about the ways we can really mobilize education as a response to some of these topics, which might be uncomfortable, hence the idea of difficult knowledge. But before we start, I'd like to thank Joe Lampert, who's here and who's been quite integral in really starting some of the activities, including some ideas behind this seminar within the social justice and diversity studies diversity disciplinary study areas. We call them ETSA here at La Trobe. So thanks, Joe, for that. And I would also make a couple of quick comments about the structure of the session before I hand it over to Joanna Barbusas, the Dean of the School of Education. So we have three speakers, as you may know. Joanna will be our first speaker. Joanna is the Professor of Teacher Education with expertise in education policy and teacher practice. Joanna's work focuses on innovative approaches to teacher ed, especially in creating university-school partnerships as well as cross-sector collaborations. And of course, we have our second speaker, Professor Michalis Zembilas from the University of from Open University Cyprus. Michalis is an honorary professor at Nelson Mandela University, South Africa, and an adjunct professor at the University of South Australia. Michalis has written quite extensively on the topics of emotion and affect in relation to social justice pedagogies, intercultural education, human rights, and citizenship education. And we also have Audrey Bryan, who's an associate professor in sociology in the School of Human Development at Dublin City University's Institute of Education. Audrey's expertise is in the area of climate change education, gender and sexuality education, anti-racism, global citizenship education, and she's currently working on the role of emotions and difficult knowledge in teaching for social justice. Now, the way we proceed today is a 20-minute presentation by each of the panelists, followed by a 10-minute discussant notes from me, if the time permits. And for the participants, if you have any burning questions, if I may ask you hold on to your questions until the end, there will be an opportunity for Q&A. And you're, of course, more than welcome to use the chat function. And I'm not really good at multitasking. I do my best to keep an eye on the incoming chat, but there will be an opportunity at the end for Q&A. And I'll also be the timekeeper for the presentations, and I'll give each panelist and speaker a sign at about 3 minutes to finish. So with that being said, I think that's all the notes I had to include. I pass it over to you, Joanna.
Thank you very much, Babak. I also would like to start with an acknowledgement of country and acknowledge the original custodians of all our lands in which this event is being held today. And for me, it's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and acknowledge that our lands have yet to be ceded. Thank you, everybody, for coming to this inaugural event for our school, but also a very important collaboration with our academics within the school and their academic relationships as well. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the presenters today. I would like to also acknowledge Dr. Babak Dadvand, who is the discussant today, but also plays a really big role in our EDSAs, as he rightly pointed out, the acronym. And these are pillars that are core to the way we think about education in our school, and also think about how we distinguish the opportunity of course development and research. But I just wanted to give, before I go into my presentation, a bit of a overview of the Dean's Seminar Series. Essentially, this is a time for us as a school and as a university to really provoke, bring to focus educational debates that are both future focused, have national and international imperatives. And it's a time to have a conversation, discussion with the opportunity of policy changes and strengthening our discipline in education. So really the Dean Seminar Series is not about the Dean, it's about the school and the expertise that we have within the school and the opportunity to collaborate with our partner stakeholders, our academics, and our thought leaders internationally and nationally. So with noting that I will be buzzed if I go over my time, I would like to begin, and I'm sure my collaborators today will have really fruitful and strong academic rigour around this concept of difficult knowledge. What I'd like to focus on today for my presentation is to propose how the policy space of teaching and teacher education often underrepresents the complexity of difficult knowledge when policy is written and advocated for. Teachers teach in spaces and places that have been shaped and baked in histories and traditions, and are often advocated through practice. We are living at a time of extreme uncertainty, as Babak and many engage with, unprecedented times and all those kind of discourses. But the policy agenda can be framed to better identify the knowledge, skills and dispositions needed for a teaching workforce for the future. The difficult knowledge of policy landscape pushes us to examine existing truths, assumptions and propositions in education. Education, as we all know, is a complex socially constructed system that musters up passion, politics, expertise, beliefs and hard research. It is regularly contested and it is difficult knowledge to work with at a policy space. In the midst of unforeseen changes through a pandemic, whole range of crises that we are still baking in, with social and health challenges never experienced in our lived experiences, another review of teacher education was launched in 2021 by the Commonwealth Government of Australia. And this was yet another review. It is often said and inferred and reverberated through the vernacular that the reason why there are multiple reviews into teacher education is because teacher education doesn't have it right. fails to deliver graduates that are ready for the profession, and it doesn't have the evidence or data to support its own curriculum practices. I refer very quickly to, and superficially at this point, I'll go back to it, to nursing and health professionals, where competencies are easy to measure, but suitability and disposition have similar complexities to teaching. Teacher education is one piece of a complex educational puzzle that grapples to prepare teachers to work with, through, and because of difficult knowledge. Knowledge of generational poverty in classrooms, knowledge of gender inequities constructed in curriculum, knowledge of racial complexities that filter through schools and early learning centres, knowledge that traumatic events and mental health shape behaviour, knowledge of social media interactions that go beyond the classroom. For these reasons, I like to consider the plethora of reviews into teacher education as a sign that all education stakeholders grapple to understand the complex issues that are galvanised in education, socially constructed and difficult to solve, and are also incredibly contextually supported, constructed, and disputed. Putting aside the political patch building opportunities that come out of the launching reviews, like the current Quality Initial Teacher Education Review, or the QUITE recommendations, I like to argue that these reviews bring to the surface the territory of difficult knowledge that live in our societies and then challenge the practices and teacher formations in the future for the future workforce. Earlier, I referred to the nursing and healthcare professionals. There is an opportunity to discuss the competency agenda in teacher education. Just bear with me on this one. If we aim to graduate teachers to be able to address difficult knowledge as they enter the profession, they need to be able to have a strong understanding of the learning sciences, to understand the scope for possible human learning and the cognitive factors that allow diverse learners to learn. The IT curriculum is a place from which designing impactful learning and understanding the creativity that can be delivered to assist learners with their own learning, from direct instruction to problem solving to project-based learning, are the competency levels needed to be assessed and built on while undertaking teacher education. An IT curriculum is purpose-built and responsive to communities of learners, and social justice and diversity is core to the way that teachers form their practice as they develop themselves as teachers and as learners themselves. These focus areas go a long way to bring to the table for all future teachers practical, theoretical, and evidence-informed approaches to how to design learning. So some of us will say, well, we already do this. But the provocation here is it as visible as we can make it? And is it a time for policymakers to actually see that in a much more deliberate way? Interestingly, the 17 recommendations launched through the QUITE review, only 7 are specifically linked to teacher education, yet the review calls on teacher education to change and reconfigure. However, to maximise transformational change, all education stakeholders need to admit that the teaching profession grapples with difficult knowledge every day. And we need to ask, is the current system fit for purpose? A schooling system designed for a society in the late 1800s, moving into an industrialized world, which was focused on economic and population growth. The byproduct, I say, this is my provocation, the byproduct of the industrialized model is the heightening of and the growth of difficult knowledge as humans learned to exist in diverse contexts. It was a schooling system aimed to manage large populations and regulate bodies to behave and reproduce economic needs to strengthen prosperity. And it is a current schooling system that we are functioning in And it is this very system that has created difficult knowledge. I will speak a little bit more about this a little later. If I take a glass half full approach, I would say that reviews, like Quite, provide an opportunity to listen and act and to work collaboratively. IT providers, school systems, employers, communities, to explore and design an education system that shapes society rather than only responding to society. But if I take a glass half empty approach, I would see the current policy climate as an opportunity to defend my patch and preserve current approaches, or what I am comfortable doing. I will now tackle, I'm just mindful of time, I will now tackle 3 areas to further position the space of difficult knowledge. When policy design is shaping the teaching profession, initial teacher education, purpose-built school system, and for the future, and the role of leadership in times of change and uncertainty are imperative in really understanding how possibilities for change can be for the future. So I'm reminded, as many of us are, as we launched into 2020, the biggest kind of, I suppose, ricochet for the profession and for teacher education more specifically was around the school placements or professional experience components of teacher education. It was the first thing that went from the profession. And this is not an opportunity to blame schools who were, in fact, pressured in significant ways and faced unforeseen constraints to their school communities and to their students, who they are absolutely committed to. But it was a system that divorced itself from the future of the teaching profession. It was an example that essentially there had to be another leadership configuration to allow for the teaching profession to be somehow helped and shaped and preserved for the future. The closing of the schools for placements is only an example for me to really think about how do we in our various systems as stakeholders really position the teaching profession for a future. I reflect on the 2020 constraints met by teachers and IT providers and considered what kind of teachers we need for a world facing crisis and uncertainty. How do we prepare education professionals to teach and lead in ways that are both classroom ready and also catastrophe ready? I won't go into that too much, but essentially the agility to act differently quickly was a very strong reminder for all educationists at the time. It was also a reminder, and really thinking about difficult knowledge in ITE is to self-reflect and examine our current ITE curriculum and say, do we have it all right? Are we willing to examine the teacher education curriculum and work without blame that a future-focused profession is not only the role of ITE, but ITE can relook at the paradigms privileged in the past and examine other paradigms to evaluate current practices. So the next area of my 3 parts is the notion of difficult knowledge in a difficult system. Thinking about a system created in a century that no longer exists, what do we need today to really position the difficult knowledges I mentioned earlier, like generational poverty, like gender inequities? These are not periphery anymore. They never were really. These are core to tackling the imperatives of education. A really interesting thing I have seen during the rolling out of crises and uncertainty is an example of workforce shape-shifting through crisis and the pandemic effects. This was, and it's been highlighted to me for various school partnership experts and leaders who have seen, as well as regulators, who have seen the move to teachers taking a more entrepreneurial approach to reshaping their own profession, building homeschooling communities and marketing themselves to their communities as fit-for-purpose schooling for their children. I am reminded by Michael Apple's research, particularly his publication, Educating the Right Way, where he identifies homeschooling as the most conservative approach to education, but badged at times, in some cases, as alternative and perhaps unconventional. These entrepreneurial moves by the teaching profession itself is an example that education stakeholders and everyone invested to economic and social sustainability need to invest both resources and thinking, some thought processes, to what kind of education system are we building towards. So finally, and I think I'm okay with timing there, Babak, I have a last point around the kind of pillars of working with difficult knowledge. And I say this as a dean, or, you know, the work of deaning has so many possibilities and constraints, shall we say. But leading change is more than defending a patch. Leading change is, and I'm going to take a particular example by Roosevelt, where he talks about the arena from which change needs to be understood and actioned. And if you're going to lead change, you have to dive into the arena, boots and all, whether you like it or not, whether you're comfortable or uncomfortable. And I propose that we are in a policy arena that is challenging us as educationists to navigate the uncertainties of a global pandemic and find solutions that best serve students in this new world. This is the moment in the work we do to identify a problem-solving arena to grapple with the schooling system that needs significant overhaul. I'm going to just use a little bit of the quote, but I have taken the gendered language out just because I just could not say those words. So the quote is, "It is not the critic who counts, not the person who points out how the strong person stumbles or where the doer or deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the person who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs and comes short again and again." So the provocation is, we can't walk away from uncertainty and disconsent or difficult knowledge. We have to face it. But in facing it, we're also challenged by the teaching profession as a whole. And we're also challenged to dare to lead and to also be brave enough to put things on the table that are not necessarily comfortable for us to engage with. So I will finish with, and concluding, with a glass half full proposition. If we take political acts, policy proposals, and progressive discourses as invitations to make changes that are to shape future populations, to navigate difficult knowledges, then we need to accept that everyone in the arena, whether we agree with them or not, have something to offer in shaping policy for teachers and teaching. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I couldn't have wished for any better timing. And thanks for that presentation and for talking about the policy really as the backdrop to thinking about difficult knowledge, especially in relation to ITE. And I'm sure there will be questions and comments which we'll get to during the Q&A. For now, we might move on to our next presenter, Michelle OSullivan, who really needs no introduction from me. So without, I guess, any further ado, Over to you, Michalos.
Thank you, Babak. Thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here. I hope you can see my screen now. Actually, Joanna ended with a nice way that fits well with the argument that I will be making. The title of my presentation is Post-Truth as Difficult Knowledge, Fostering Affective Solidarity in Anti-Racist Education. And I would like to start with a concept that has become very popular in recent times, post-truth. There are many claims that we are presently living in a post-truth era. And the definition from the Oxford Dictionary, by the way, it was the word of the year in 2016. It is that post-truth is relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. So there seems to be like emotion and personal belief comes in the forefront compared to objective facts that are downplayed and put in the background. It has received large attention, especially in the aftermath of Brexit and the US presidential elections in 2016. Now, some people might argue, well, the undermining of objective facts is not a new idea, and this is correct. So the question is, what is new about post-truth? And the new idea, the new kind of understanding of post-truth is that the use of post-truths is the use of post-truths to promote racist, misogynistic, and neo-nationalist views. This is, again, not entirely new, but it has been used in a new way that has made post-truth kind of come at the forefront. Now, the classic example that is being used is that of Donald Trump. And there is a lot of literature, especially in recent years, arguing that Donald Trump has educated his audience in racism, sexism, white supremacy, and ableism, and normalized fascist ideas. So he's used it like the epitome of post-truth, of how post-truth is used in this new way to promote racist and neo-nationalist ideas. Now, what I'm trying to do in this paper is promote the notion of post-truth as difficult knowledge for a variety of audiences. So on the one hand, we have a rejection of what used to be perceived as unquestionable facts concerning racism, and how that may be experienced as deeply hurtful. And on the other hand, we also have the interrogating of the comfort that post-truth claims offer to those who are ideologically aligned to such claims. And that is also experienced as painful. And I'm going to say a little bit more about this later with Arlie Hochschild's classic book, Strangers in Their Own Land, how people who buy into post-truth claims are not all racist or all neo-nationalist, and they also experience painful feelings, and they also experience difficult knowledge. So this is a different way of understanding post-truth as difficult knowledge. It's not one-sided, and this is what I'm going to try to play with in this paper. So post-truth is difficult knowledge because it deeply challenges both affectively and epistemologically some people's ways of being and living in the world. My argument is that the problem of post-truth is not going to be resolved by simply correcting the epistemological basis of knowledge. In other words, the issue is not going to be resolved by offering more critical education or more media literacy. I would argue this is the easy way out, and this is not always effective. So there is an intellectualization of post-truth going on here. Rather, what is needed is a pedagogy that not only handles the variable experience of pain that emerges from post-truth as difficult knowledge, but also invents affirmative ways of living with others that revitalize affective relationality. And in particular, in this paper, I'm entertaining the notion of affective solidarity. So fostering affective solidarity is a productive way, productive pedagogical response to post-truth claims, because it moves beyond mere rejection of the epistemological grounding of those claims. And I will provide an example later to show that. So affective solidarity is about finding common ground to struggle together and change the world in ways that benefit everyone. The central question in my paper is, what may affective solidarity offer to anti-racist education that could be valuable in this particular post-truth moment? And I will discuss a little bit about some concept first, the affective ideology of post-truth, post-truth as a form of difficult knowledge, the notion of affective solidarity. Then I will briefly discuss an example from my teaching to show the potential of this idea. And finally, I will finish with some pedagogical implications. So first of all, the notion of affective ideology. As I mentioned before, post-truth is about the declining value of truth and its replacement with emotion and personal belief. Now, some people have argued that this is a victory of emotion over reason. And I would question that, because there is a lot, I think this is a flawed dichotomy to introduce another dichotomy between emotion and reason. There is a lot of work in affect theory in recent years that theorize emotions and affects not as psychological or individual entities that are inside the body, separated from reason, but rather they are situated in social, cultural, moral, and political conditions in which they are entangled with power relations. So affective ideology, a notion that has been introduced by Peters and Thornby in 2017, is this entanglement between the affective, the epistemological, and the political. In other words, ideology is not only about beliefs, it's about affects as well. That's why it's affective. And the classic examples we could offer is, the notion of post-truth itself, or Trump's right-wing populism. They are forms of affective ideology. So how can we understand now post-truth as a form of difficult knowledge to build the argument step by step? Difficult knowledge has been theorized as this notion of both representations of social trauma in curriculum and the learner's encounters with them in pedagogy. So knowledge becomes difficult when our affective and epistemological certainties are challenged. These affective troubles or affective dissonances, some theories call it in the literature, are not the same for everyone. And this is important to understand. And they are not experienced in the same manner by all of us. So, for example, post-truth claims, such as the one made by Trump on immigration, on crime, on race relations, that all Mexicans are rapists, or those racist comments, would amount to nothing less than blunt racist views. On the other hand, similarly, those who buy into post-truths may also experience difficult knowledge. They also experience difficult knowledge when their ways of living and being are not recognized or they are rejected. So there are numerous examples in Arlie Hochschild's book, Strangers in Their Own Land, about how poor whites in the South feel neglected because they don't get the same benefits or the same attention as immigrants, or or other people. And this is something that we also have to take into consideration. And this is one of the reasons why Trump got into power. So we cannot underestimate the power of difficult knowledge that other populations are feeling. So the pedagogical question for me is how might educators create conditions to the extent that is possible that transform this affective dissonance as it is differentially experienced and transform it into affective solidarity. Is this possible? So let me say a few things about affective solidarity. The need for a concept of solidarity that allows those who feel marginalized for different reasons to derive their sense of living in the world not from the commitment to identity or a truth regime, but from an affective investment in the conversation with others who struggle in similar yet also different ways to live better in the world. So there is an affective investment in an ongoing conversation. This is put in the forefront, not the commitment to any identity claims, especially any essentialist identity claims, or any truth regimes. So affective solidarity asks individuals to what indigenous scholar Tolbert calls stand with others and bring change that will benefit everyone. Affective solidarities go beyond empathy, which is criticized because it may lead to sentimental attachment to the other rather than a genuine engagement with his or her concerns. Affective solidarity goes a step further. There is a commitment to action, such as the desire to reduce suffering and help others, reduce suffering for everyone, not selectively. And the question is, well, can we do this even with those who disagree with? This is a fundamental question. And some may argue, and I sometimes realize that it may not be possible. We have such deep disagreements with some people or some groups that it may be impossible. But what I'm arguing is that, well, let's explore this first before we decide what is possible and what is not. So on the basis of difficult knowledge as the basis for a better living in the world. So the example that I give in the paper is a course that I used to teach in a group of Greek Cypriot police officers. I've been teaching this course for years. I've been invited by the police force in Cyprus to offer a course on race, racism, and anti-racist education, with variable effects, I might say, not always successful. So I have faced and I have heard a lot of racist and post-truth claims and beliefs by the police officers. So I was trying to figure out a pedagogical way of engaging with this. And the initial strategy that I described in this particular incident is the classic epistemological approach, a data-driven approach. Okay, here are the statistics. Here is what the European Union says about racist police force, about racism in the society. So I was giving a lot of facts, and eventually, this is something that it was not particularly liked by my audience of police officers because they took it personally. It's what it was like claiming they are racist. I didn't say that, but this is how they perceive it. So eventually, to cut the long story short, I shifted my strategy to what I'm suggesting in this paper, the notion of affective solidarity, and instead I brought in the forefront stories of how police officers in Cyprus stood with migrants and helped them. So I brought police officers to narrate their own stories of helping migrants instead of taking this confrontational stance of showing that there is racism in the society or racism in the police force, which got them defensive. So the lesson learned in the absence of time to go into the detail is that it's not good telling people they should simply abandon their post-truth claims and then assume this is an effective way of combating racism. So I'm going to end with a couple of pedagogical implications that emerge from this sort of analysis and this sort of engagement with the notion of affective solidarity. Move away from the assumption that there is a uniform experience of affective dissonance among those who engage with post-truth in the classroom. People engage with post-truth and feel affective dissonance in differential ways, not uniform ways. Acknowledge these different ways and take into consideration those complexities. There is need for sensitive and strategic pedagogical interventions. And by strategic, I mean a step-by-step approach that takes into considerations those differential experiences of affective dissonance. So don't assume there is a uniform audience and everybody feels the same sort of dissonance, but actually take into consideration the different experiences, even with those we disagree with. In fact, I think it's more important to take into consideration those who we disagree with if we want to be more effective. The goal of such pedagogical interventions is not to make students feel the right way about the other. So it's not a sort of moral education that they should feel this way because it's the right way. The goal is to create spaces for non-destructive and non-identity-based consciousness of the other, to recognize the affective complexities in combating racism and to cultivate affective solidarity even with those we have differences, to the extent that is possible. And sometimes we may recognize that it's not possible. But again, let's explore this and let's exclude this possibility before we decide that this is impossible to do. Epistemological evidence alone does not seem to be a particular good way or effective way to convince people of anything except that they are already right, even when they are wrong. So what is needed is an affective rupture with the ways post-truths are experienced as difficult knowledge by different people. So to nurture affective solidarity as a pedagogical strategy that could address the differential affective dissonance emerging in encounters with post-truth claims. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm eager to hear your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Michalinus. That was great, and I guess you've left us with a lot to think about and return to during the Q&A. I'm aware of time, and so I'll make no further comment at this point, and but to welcome Audrey, who's our third speaker for today.
Thank you so much, Babak. Good morning, everyone from Dublin, or rather good afternoon to those of you who are in Melbourne. It's such an honour to be part of this inaugural Dean's Seminar on Global Challenges and Difficult Knowledge in Teaching and Teacher Education. I'm extremely grateful for the invitation to be part of this really rich dialogue. And I'd like to express particular thanks to Joe Lambert, to Joanne, to Georgina, and of course to Babak for everything that they've all done to make today's event possible. My point of departure today is what I would regard as a taken for grantedness within mainstream educational thinking about the perceived irrelevance of emotion to education. And while I'm very conscious that scholars such as Michalinus have written very extensively about the importance of emotions in education, and have spoken very eloquently about it just there, the failure to take emotions seriously within many teacher education programs has meant that those charged with teaching affect-laden topics often do so with very little theoretical understanding or indeed pedagogical preparation in how to navigate the complex feelings that these can evoke or how best to cultivate emotional registers of critical hope, affective solidarity that Michelinas has just spoken of, or possibility. My own current research is concerned with the question of what educationally and socially transformative possibilities exist when emotion, affect, and feeling are taken seriously in education. I advocate for the foregrounding of emotion in teaching and teacher education, and a consideration of the role that feelings, affect, and emotion play in either facilitating or indeed getting in the way of learning about global challenges such as the climate crisis, racism, conflict, and so on. So what I'd like to do in this presentation is to share with you some of the pedagogical possibilities that exist when both positive and negative affect are foregrounded in teaching and learning. So I'll begin with a brief consideration of the role that laughter, humor, and an overall atmosphere of playfulness can serve in teaching about global challenges. While humor, laughter, and playfulness may seem incongruent with the gravity of the myriad crises and injustices confronting humanity, I want to suggest that they serve several functions, including acting as a slantwise entry point into complex subject matter that can help to demystify themes and topics that might otherwise feel too difficult to broach, and affording us with cathartic cultural spaces within which the expanse of human emotions can be legitimized and new meanings generated. My advocacy of a slantwise engagement is inspired by Kathleen Quinlivan's account of the use of art to approach sexuality education from different and unexpected angles to enable more expansive possibilities to be considered. It's further inspired by Emily Dickinson's poem, Tell All the Truth, but Tell It Slant, the closing lines of which instruct us that as lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. So in my own teaching, I draw quite a bit on popular culture as a pedagogical tool through which to engage difficult knowledge. And the example that I'm going to draw upon now is a scene from the series Derry Girls, which I think some of you may be familiar with. And this is, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's essentially a comedic kind of coming of age story that details the lives of 5 teenagers living in Derry in Northern Ireland in the mid-1990s, kind of, you know, in the height of the Troubles, but kind of, you know, where peace was starting to look like more of a possibility. So it's kind of this hopeful moment in Northern Ireland, Irish history that's being captured. And this is the period that in Ireland and Northern Ireland we refer to as the Troubles. So this is this period that was marred by, you know, 3 decades of political violence. And the scene that I'm going to share with you, technology permitting, is one of the most famous scenes from the show. It's kind of colloquially referred to as the blackboard scene. And it takes place in this episode of the series called Friends Across the Barricade. The episode is about a cross-community peace-building initiative that was designed to promote greater tolerance and understanding among students from the highly segregated Catholic and Protestant communities in Northern Ireland. For those of you who aren't familiar with this, who are familiar with the scene, you'll know that things don't quite go according to plan. Now I just want to double check that I have my sound on. Yeah, okay. So fingers crossed this one. So Father Peter really does have amazing hair, I have to say. One of the most remarkable things about the show is the skillfulness with which it manages to illuminate the absurdity of the Northern Ireland conflict without undermining its severity or ignoring its devastating effects. And whereas the ubiquity of the gravity of the Troubles is continuously referenced, Derry Girls frequently gestures towards the possibilities of a reimagined post-conflict identity through its subversive and at times hysterical engagement with the ideologies and identity categories that underpinned and sustained the conflict. As Maggie Long remarks, in providing a space for us to laugh at or with the stereotypes that ridicule the basis of the political conflict, Derry Girls offers a cultural container for generations of bigotry, sectarianism, and intolerance that underpinned and reinforced political violence in Northern Ireland. In doing so, Derry Girls subtly urges us to challenge our own assumptions and to begin to contain our own distress, end quote. For those audience who aren't directly impacted by the Northern Ireland conflict, the use of humour has the potential to diffuse feelings of emotional detachment that might otherwise accompany educational encounters with difficult knowledge, particularly if that content feels unrelatable or incomprehensible. Whereas the popularity of Derry Girls has been attributed to its idiosyncratic humour, perhaps its biggest accomplishment is its capacity to prompt critical reflection and dialogue about the Troubles via moments of great poignancy. And one of the show's most poignant scenes takes place during the season finale of season 1, and it begins with one of the teenagers, Orla's step aerobics performance during the school's talent show. So we'll just take a quick look at that now. So if you haven't seen the series, just by way of context, that particular scene where Granda Joe puts his hand on his son-in-law's shoulder there as a display of affection and empathy, it's particularly poignant because Granda Joe spends most of his time ridiculing his son-in-law, referring to him as things like a useless shite and a prick. So it's all the more poignant that he's expressing his empathy and solidarity in that moment. And I was reading a blog post about this particular scene written by somebody called Katie Kawa, and she described this moment as getting you right in the feels. And that's kind of what I've taken that expression as the title of the talk. Alternating between gut-punching poignancy and hilarity, the emotional evocativeness that permeates Derry Girls has significant pedagogical potential in terms of at once centralizing and legitimizing the range of emotions that learners feel when they encounter difficult knowledge, as well as providing them with opportunities to question and reflect upon the processes and political ideologies that underpin and promote political violence. So in addition to popular culture, I think art, film, and imagery can serve as very valuable springboards for reflecting on and working through negative emotions and feelings that arise when learners are confronted with difficult knowledge. I'm talking here primarily about emotions such as shame, guilt, and loss, and so on, which are often experienced in response to being invited to see ourselves as involved in or implicated in various social inequalities and injustices. Now, I don't have time to dwell on this, and it's possibly quite difficult to see, but this is just, I suppose, to reference some of my recent work in this area in relation to climate change education. So I've devised what I call a social ecology of responsibility framework, or SURF. And if you are interested in this, you can read more about this in the special issue that Babak edited, that Michelinos has also contributed to. I have a piece in there on climate change education and pedagogy of the implicated. And in that paper, I discuss how climate change art is a useful tool to promote critical reflection and understanding of learners' own implication in the climate crises, while simultaneously inviting them to view themselves as active agents in its amelioration. For example, so one of the pieces that I talk about in that article is Bahia Shahab's Pyramid of Garbage installation in Cairo, home of the Great Pyramids of Giza. And I think this work offers a particularly striking and effective illustration of our implication in the destruction of the planet. When I say our here, I'm referring to those of us who live in emissions-intensive societies, consumer capitalist societies. The enormity of the structure, which juxtaposes the eternity and majesty of the Great Pyramids of Giza with the ugliness and wastefulness of overconsumption, makes it difficult to deny the destructiveness of routine consumeristic practices and choices, while simultaneously posing wider questions of collective responsibility. It's not so obvious in this image, but there's a video of the construction of the installation online, which makes that juxtaposition with the pyramids of Giza much more obvious. So again, if you're interested in the work, you can check that out online just by Googling pyramid of garbage. In making us bear witness to the destruction of this majestic landscape, this arresting monument paves the way to ethical and political transformation. The negative affect viewers experience while interacting with the installation may derive from being asked to bear witness to the deleterious effects of consumer capitalism, which foster human greed and wastefulness. The negative affective weight of the monument serves as an invitation to respond otherwise to the ecological crisis by altering consumption practices that drive climate change, as well as the wider ideologies and systems that endorse and sustain them. So from this perspective, the grief that accompanies this challenged eternity can be a productive rather than a disabling emotion. In asking us to bear witness to the magnitude and ugliness of ecological decline and to consider our legacy on this planet by critically reflecting on and working through our epistemological and affective responses to this difficult knowledge, the possibility of mitigating the climate crisis becomes more palpable. In closing, genres such as art, film, and other forms of popular culture can serve as valuable springboards from which to approach difficult knowledge themes obliquely rather than head-on, and in ways that eschew didacticism. They can help to demystify otherwise complex themes, and most crucially, perhaps, they can promote a politics of potentiality, possibility, and critical hope. I'll close by reiterating those remarkable lines from Emily Dickinson: as lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Audrey, for sharing your work with us. I found that quite fascinating. Now I take off my chair hat and I put my metaphorical discussant hat on, and just reflecting on the three presentations today, I guess there are really lots of takeaways, but I would just like to make a brief comment perhaps around three of the points that have stood out to me. The first point, I guess, is really going back to that basic and elementary question about what makes knowledge difficult and for who. And I think that came through the presentations. And when I think about this question, I guess on the one hand, I see this as an ontological and epistemological question about the content of knowledge, which Michalinos talked about, which might deal with forms of violence, inequities, injustices, and historical traumas. But on the other hand, I think the question of what makes knowledge difficult and for who is a question that has to do with our relations to the difficult knowledge. For instance, I'm thinking if the past, present, or even future injustices don't affect me directly, what does that mean about my responsibilities towards the affected parties? And this is where I believe there is both a bit of a challenge and an opportunity to make difficult knowledge not only relevant to the practice of teachers and pedagogically, but also to turn difficult knowledge into what can be looked at as ethical and political imperative for teachers and teacher educators. And this is where, again, I also believe that the work that Michael Rothberg has done on the implicated subject and Audrey referred to is quite relevant in really teasing out the complex ways and uneven ways as well, which we might be all implicated in the suffering of the other, without really being the direct perpetrator of injustice. And I think there is pedagogical implications for in that. The challenge then, I guess, might be how to make difficult knowledge relevant in classrooms, especially in contexts where students and teachers may not be directly affected by injustices. And I found the work you presented, Audrey, quite powerful in looking at how, for instance, climate crisis and the example that you just shared really implicates all of us. This doesn't mean that we are all equally implicated in and responsible for it, but I guess it gives us a more nuanced vocabulary to talk about our relations to the other and the environment as well. Now, the second point that stood out to me, especially in your work, Michalos, is whether critique and being critical on their own are adequate for consciousness raising and social transformation. I guess the idea of being critical and raising consciousness has always been central to the critical theoretical perspectives in social sciences and in education. And it's here that I was also reminded of the work that Sebastian Schindler has done in I think the title is The Task of Critique in the Times of Posttruth, and you talked about the post-truth politics as a form of difficult knowledge. And the argument that Schindler puts forward is that post-truth presents a problem for critical theory because it relativizes facts while at the same time elevates unsubstantiated claims to the status of truth. And again, part of the problem, as you pointed out, Michalos, is that our dominant mode of critique have been traditionally based on relatively narrow terms that assume the presentation of data and facts and alternative perspectives are sufficient to unsettle deeply held assumptions and disrupt inequitable practices. And I think the example from the teaching of the police forces about anti-racism was a stark reminder of this. And I guess this also reflects on, in some forms and shapes, almost a Cartesian duality of mind and body, with the mind being associated with the rational, with the thinking, with often the male, whereas the body is associated and has been associated with the irrational, with the emotional, and erroneously with the female throughout the history of the Western political thought up until quite recently. So part of the task for teacher educators is to identify, as I think your examples and Audrey's examples also pointed to expand the parameters of critique to find opportunities for productive encounters with difficult knowledge. And I think we had some very rich examples from both of your works, which I found quite fascinating. Now, and this also leads me to the third point. I'll make this one the last one and a brief one. Is really about the conditions that are most constructive for engagement with difficult knowledge. And for me, this opens the space for asking a number of other questions, which I would just talk about briefly as more provocations. One would be, how can we really engage productively with difficult knowledge in ways that can take people with alternative views on board with the task of critique? And I think, Michalos, you also talked about this in your presentation. And I find this relevant, especially when we ask teachers to lead conversations about topics that might be difficult in their context. For instance, talking about displacement of Indigenous and First Nations people in settler colonial countries, talking about the climate crisis in schools and communities that have traditionally relied on coal mining and logging industries for their livelihood, and talking about gender non-conforming students in perhaps more conservative school settings. And here is where I also find the work of Claire Hemmings that you referenced on affective solidarity also very relevant, because it gives us some tools for thinking about our relations with the other, not so much based on perhaps understanding the other and knowing the other, because that's perhaps not feasible, but rather by building solidarity based upon the shared experience of being misplaced and vulnerable in the world. And the second question I make as my last point here is about the conditions, back to the question of what conditions are most productive for engaging with pedagogical knowledge, is what infrastructure do we really need to facilitate that engagement on part of educators? And Joanna, you're setting the scene by talking about policy and numerous reviews of initial teacher education. I think gives us some really tool thinking in terms of how can we really enable our teachers to engage productively with difficult knowledge, especially when we see all these reviews coming out and the teachers' work being sort of scrutinized, and the systems of accountability, which are narrowly tied to test-based performativities for teachers, and also the great focus on teacher performance criteria. Now, the question that remains open for me is that are we simply adding to the emotional labor of teachers by asking them to do equity work by engaging with difficult knowledge, when the formal policy landscape and the formal educational frameworks promote a rather technocratic approach to the profession? So these are and where some of the thinking threads I found myself really pausing on while listening to your presentation today. I might just leave it there, and maybe we can open the floor for some, I'm putting my chair hat back on, comments and questions. And I know the most difficult part of this is getting the first question. So who wants to be the first one to ask questions or comments?
I'm happy to put my hand up and make a comment and ask a question, just to get the ball rolling. So look, thank you everyone. That's been great. I really, really enjoyed the various talks and the dialogue between you all. It's such an important area for us to be exploring. So my name's Jane Wilkinson. I'm at Monash University in Australia, and I do research in educational leadership. And one of our projects has been around looking at the role that schools and school leaders play in building more socially cohesive communities in really socially volatile times. So just picking up that last point from the discussant, Babak, that, the question, I think, around the fairness of asking teachers and educators to be doing this kind of work, particularly in a time when things are so technocratic. I'm going to make a comment, but then I'd really like your responses as a panel, is that the school leaders who are working, particularly in these very culturally diverse communities, but also communities that had like radicalised students, radicalised in terms of the alt-right and supporting Trump and being incredibly misogynistic, etc. They were being forced to try and deal with all these sorts of situations, but they didn't actually feel very well equipped to be, to how to handle these sorts of situations and how to kind of work in more socially cohesive ways, or ways that really kind of tapped into the affective aspects of what was going on. It was really coming out as a huge issue in the schools that we work with. So, I mean, I'm just interested in your thoughts around that. What I'm trying to say is that it's happening. Whether it's fair or unfair, educators being asked to do this kind of work anyway. So you've sketched some ideas, I think there, particularly Audrey and Michalinos, about what possibly can be done. But I just wondered if the panel might want to expand a bit more around that, because it's a huge issue.
Shall we respond, Babak?
Anyone?
Yeah. You start first, Michalinos.
Okay, I'm happy to start. Thank you, Jane, for your question, and thank you, Babak, for your questions and comments. Let me start by acknowledging, yes, that basically what we are asking teachers to do is emotional labor, or affective labor, whatever you want to call it, and this is inevitable. And fortunately, there has been increasing work in the field of educational leadership and administration and management in recent years that does acknowledge this, the importance of engaging with affects and emotions, both coming out of Australia and other places around the world. So I guess, Jane, to respond to your question is that the first thing is for school leaders to be able to acknowledge these affective moments and how to process them, not individually, but as part of the theoretical framework that I mentioned before, that is socially and politically situated within particular settings. So, and it's not a matter of teacher education programs or leadership academies or programs to do that. I guess it has to happen at multiple levels. It has to happen definitely at the level of their preparation as school leaders, but it has to continue like within the community. And it's not only the responsibility of the school leader, but also those around them, the school leadership team, to be able to hold each other accountable, to be able to process and analyze these affective moments, to empathize, not in a superficial way, for example, but to critically empathize with each other and acknowledge the moments and their affective engagements and their implications in everyday life. So I guess there's no magic recipe, but what I like to call is this, step-by-step approach where you cannot start immediately transforming the whole school from one day to the next, but it's a whole process that everybody is involved, from the school leadership team, the teachers, the parents, and to send messages that, for example, racism is not tolerated in this school. This is a whole school approach. It's not a matter of one individual leader to do that. And if there is emotional labor involved with this, of course there is. I think it's inevitable. And there are different ways of handling this emotional labor, again, not as an individual thing, as a burden of the individual, but as something that is distributed within the community and within the whole school. So as long as everybody understands that this is everybody's responsibility, and it's not the responsibility of the school leader to take on this emotional labor by himself or by herself or by themselves, then I think it's going to be an important step forward to actually start realizing the complexities that we've been talking about in this panel. So I'll stop there, and maybe I'll come back later for. Thank you.
Vivek, I'll add to that as well. Thank you, Jane. That's a great comments and a great question. And I think just following on from Michalinos, it's difficult to deal with difficult knowledge as an individual. The whole construct of the arena that I was referring to is that the arena is becoming bigger and bigger, and educators are really forced, be it new teachers, mid-career teachers or leaders, of the scope of the arena is growing to the extent where there has to be an opportunity for policymakers to actually clearly understand that it's not just about adding to the work of teachers, but acknowledging the complexity that sits within a school context, a community context. And you're absolutely right. I talk to principals pretty much every day who say, the work I'm doing today is not the work I did 20 years ago. And that complexity really it needs to be compartmentalized for some teachers. So, for example, not all teachers can do everything at a given time. And I think for us, as particularly in teacher education, new teachers need to be cognizant of the system sector approach to the big, difficult knowledge, but they also have to be given opportunities to win, opportunities to say, actually, I can do this, or there are ways of engaging with or understanding particular knowledge so that I can make a difference. Because if there isn't a win in an everyday context, you will actually really engage with, you know, a discontented, you know, profession.
Audrey, do you want to have a go at answering that question?
Yeah, thanks, Babak. Yeah, just maybe to follow on from what Joanna has said there. Just as you were speaking, I was kind of brought back to, I was recently listening to a podcast with Margaret Atwood, and she was talking about, you know, various, you know, crises, climate crisis and whatnot. And one of the comments she made was, you know, we tend to look away when we feel, particularly when we feel powerless, you know, in relation to the issue that we're looking away from. And I think it links to this idea that Joanna was speaking to around difficult knowledge, and, you know, how much more challenging this kind of work is as an educator when you feel like you're acting in isolation. So the importance of cultivating meaningful communities of practice, I think, is absolutely key, you know. And I think really capitalizing on the fact that new teachers entering the profession tend to be, by and large, quite idealistic. They have a sense of really wanting to make a difference. They have an understanding of themselves as change makers. So it is about equipping them with conceptual, methodological, practical tools, not just in terms of, you know, how to navigate, you know, challenging circumstances and realities, but also equipping them with, I suppose, a broader understanding of what contemporary sort of dominant discourses are around emotion. And I suppose I have a major concern with the increasing neuroscientification of education and the extent to which incredibly reductive perspectives on emotion are being advanced within teacher education and its association with ed tech and the corporatization of education. But many teachers are internalizing this idea that, you know, the affective realm within education is all about emotional regulation, and it's all about equipping young people to, you know, be able to self-manage their well-being, to be resilient, to be agile, you know. And to me, that's a really dangerous kind of pathway. And it's for me, it's about equipping teachers with the critical capacity to be able to problematize and kick back against this very narrow view of education, so that they can embrace, you know, a radically different sense of themselves and what their role as educators is. And yes, it is absolutely very demanding. It's very labor intensive. But, you know, once we establish, you know, trustworthiness, relationality, equipping people with those kinds of skills, I think they will feel more agentic and more willing and able to embrace the realities of their classrooms.
Absolutely, and hopefully, I found a lot of examples that could really be from this seminar that could help in that direction. I'm just aware of time, and I think we have time for one quick question or comment, if anyone wants to throw their hat into the ring. Well, I thought getting the first question would be difficult.
But can I just make a quick comment?
Yeah, go for it, Benny.
I think for me, I found the three presentations very different, but equally provocative. And I guess the challenge for me in my work in teacher education is, how do we actually make sense of this and actually put it into action when we're, you know, I know Joanna talked a lot about reviews, but we're also, you know, bound by so much policy and accreditation and constraints. So thinking through that, I think I've really enjoyed the presentations to actually help me try to think about, well, how do I make this in practice? You know, make this in practice. How do I do this in practice and actually stay true to all the constraints and restraints at the same time as being provocative and dealing with the difficulties? So I just really wanted to thank the presenters for that publication, those publications.
All right, thank you, Bernie. Well, now I'm just looking at the clock, and I think we are sort of approaching 5 p.m. here, Melbourne time. And I know that many of you may already have other commitments, so we might end this seminar here. Thanks everyone for attending La Trobe's School of Education Dean's inaugural seminar, and a special thanks to our speakers, Michalinos, Audrey, and Joanna. Have a great morning, afternoon, or evening, depending where you are. And we look forward to seeing you again soon, perhaps in our next seminar. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thanks everybody.